Only Lore, a podcast about games and the tables we play them at. Your DMs tonight, and every night, are Josh and Chris. You can find us on all podcast platforms, or check us out at noplotonlylore.com. If you like what you hear today, please rate and review the show, and share it with everyone you've ever met.
So, you wanted to talk this week about combat and everything that is good, bad, or otherwise about combat in the various systems that we've explored and talked about before. Obviously, the big one being Dungeons and Dragons, but combat is handled in some form in I think just about every role-playing setting. Violence and physical altercations are a reality of life, and you need to prepare for them and have a way to resolve them. But they're more than just, I want to go punch everything and kill everyone in a 10-mile radius. So let's delve into the, what defines combat, what makes combat interesting, and what makes it useful from a narrative perspective instead of just a way to siphon experience points out of dogs and monsters and into your heroes.
Okay, so I'm super impressed at how podcasty and radio host that intro sounded. You just I don't know what happened, but a switch flipped, and you were just like, "Cool, we're on the radio now. Let's go."
So I don't know if you remember this, but I was a radio host for 3 years.
Yeah, I do remember that.
So it's slowly coming back.
Yeah, I have occasionally been a problematic guest. I've been an occasional problematic guest on radio shows.
It's okay. So. It's my turn to be problematic.
Yeah. I did a couple of shows for the U of A radio for a little bit. But yeah, combat.
Yeah, combat. So broadly speaking, combat, we would define it as the need for player characters to physically impose their will on the game.
Yeah, enact their personal will on the universe through horrific acts of violence.
And at its most basic method, it's you're going to use your spells and weapons and various other trickery to kill whatever's trying to kill you before it gets that task completed.
I'd actually roll that back a little bit. I don't think the horrific acts of violence are necessary for combat. I would say that almost every role-playing game that I've ever played has a conflict resolution system, an opposed conflict resolution system that can get pretty detailed. But I don't know if an act of violence is necessarily required for that in every system. But for D&D it definitely is. D&D, the combat system is very much I stab it with the pointy bits of whatever I'm carrying until it dies.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because recently I've been exposed to and sort of adopting a bit of a different way of thinking about combat and hit points as a mechanism in D&D. Mm-hmm. The idea being not that, every time I swing with my sword, I'm opening little cuts and rents and wounds in my opponent, but more that hit points essentially represent energy, the ability of your opponent to properly deflect and mitigate your attacks during a fight. And eventually one of you wears the other one down where a single opening exposes itself for that fatal blow to come through. So you're not just inflicting a death by 1,000 cuts in this weird sort of cooperative mutilation, but you're two people who are both competent and both have a vested interest in not dying, and eventually one of you is just able to outskill the other. But there's lots of ways to look at it. I mean, a large brutish creature with a huge pool of hit points but a very low AC, I kind of think of as something that's just your standard. I can just take a lot of abuse and go on for quite a while without really putting much skill into it. Something with higher AC but lower health, it definitely, to me, shows someone who's more nimble and more skilled with their blade or their shield or something, so that they are getting out of the way of attacks and every time they do make a mistake, it takes more out of them because they just don't have the strength to kind of compete with you on that level. So
there's a couple of systems that I've seen that like make that really explicit too, right? Like
sure.
I think probably the best example is Mouse Guard. Doesn't have hit points.
Okay.
When you enter into a conflict, and Mouse Guard does the same conflict resolution system for like an argument or like an actual fight or like anything where two or more groups of people are going to be in competition in any way. And at the beginning of each fight, you actually roll for your effective hit points. It's your resolve. So you roll for your resolve, and then when your resolve is out, the fight is over, and you have lost.
Okay, yeah. So you're really assessing your moment to moment sort of capabilities as opposed to just a generic sort of I'm always this good.
Yeah, like how fighty are you today?
Yeah,
right.
And like, I'm assuming that your resolve can be modified in a lot of different ways depending on factors and conditions and bonuses.
Oh, for sure. Like one of the coolest things about Mouse Guard is that failing at stuff gives you the opportunity to get status effects, sort of. So you can like fail at a thing, and either you'll get like a plot twist to the game, or you can take the tired status effect, which takes dice out of your dice pool. And so when you go to roll for your resolve, you have one fewer dice to roll that resolve roll with, and so you're tired, and so you just don't want to fight as much.
Yeah, I get it, and I love it. Or the idea that like, maybe you've taken too many fights that day, so now instead of rolling a D10 resolve dice, you're rolling a D6 because you just don't have as much left in the tank. I really like that idea.
I wonder if you could translate that to D&D. Like this isn't necessarily like on topic for what we're talking about, but like you could absolutely just roll your hit dice for your resolve at the beginning of fights.
I was going to say you could 100% do that, or maybe that might be too frequent to do it and it doesn't quite work mechanically. But if you did it like every morning in the game on like longer adventure,
at the end of every long rest, you roll your resolve at the end of every long rest.
Exactly. Yeah.
I might have to experiment with that.
No, just came up with
we house ruled
homework. Anyways,
all right. So the thing that I really wanted to talk about is that like the vast majority of combat scenarios that are run at tables suck. Like,
yes, if you're viewing them through the traditional "we must fight everything" lens, absolutely, it's very.
I don't even know if it's just like that lens. I think it's just like the combat flow that happens, especially in Dungeons and Dragons, is really cyclical, and it's really predictable. You know what's going to happen. Like, my initiative comes, I take my action, I take my move, I take my bonus action if I have one, and then it's not my turn anymore, right? And so you just kind of go through the motions every time it comes around to your turn, and you kind of know what you're going to be up to. If you're like a wizard or like a spellcaster, then you've got a lot more options kicking around, like a bunch of different abilities that you can throw down with. Fighters get a whole bunch of different attacks and shit, but like the basic play flow is always very like similar to the previous fight that you were in. And so if it's just you versus a group of nondescript bad guys, and it's almost always you versus a group of nondescript bad guys hacking away at each other in a like 8x12 room, then it's going to just be boring, and it's going to take like an hour and a half to finish.
Sure. And I completely agree, because that is what kept me out of Dungeons and Dragons for a long time. I was very much on the wargamer side of things when I kind of first got into hobby settings in general, and I didn't like the idea of all of my melee classes just being, okay, it's my turn, I hit it with a stick and repeat ad infinitum. Now, and I warned you ahead of time that this was going to happen, but
we're rolling out the addition warning.
That is something that it's not even wars. I'm just giving my personal experience. What drew me into 4th edition initially was looking over the player classes and realizing, as a fighter, as a barbarian, as any melee class or like basic attack based class like you would have now with rangers or things like that, I had something to do, and not just on my turn but on other turns as well. because they really explored the space of what does a bonus action mean? What does a reaction mean? And how can we use that effectively to keep players engaged from round to round, between just literally spacing out on your phone, waiting for your initiative to come back up so you can move 5 squares and hit it with your axe again. They really thought about like, well, let's what can we do to not only sort of muddy the waters on your turn, where the delineation between like move, action, bonus action suddenly got a lot more blurred, where you started having a lot more combined effects, where not only are you making an attack for damage and moving yourself, but also buffing your friends, moving your opponents, really manipulating the battlefield across, I think, every character. Like every class I can think of had some sort of way to interact with the opponents in a much more interesting way than just I'm going to whittle down their health until they fall over.
You say that you came into it from like the wargaming background, because now that I'm thinking about it, like 4th edition's abilities and stuff, like they get clowned on a lot for being too much like World of Warcraft, but I think in a lot of ways they actually reflect more modern war games, right? Like
Yeah, they reflect modern skirmish games. I mean, the Warhammer world is doing this exact thing with Underworlds. Their 5-man team thing, and I, with the move to 5th edition and exploring other options as things progress here, starting to dabble in some Pathfinder. One thing I do as a DM and less so as a player, because I don't want to sort of take that control of the table away, but I definitely encourage some house rules that blend at the very least movement and action, so that you can do more things and find more interesting, unique things. And it's nothing crazy. I mean, it's something as simple as I really appreciated the charging rules from 4th edition. So I just said, guess what? If you play 5th edition with me, you don't have to take a feat. Everyone can just do that basic charge where you just move and make a melee basic. That's it. Because I think it makes sense that my martial character can just put the sharp end in front of him and run at you.
Yeah. Well, and
right?
like the entire idea of taking your entire action to like move extra spaces, I mean, I get it from a balance standpoint where you wouldn't necessarily want somebody to have that kind of mobility right away, but like just moving in a straight line towards a bad guy and then like bowling him over or stabbing him with stuff, like that feels like it should be one action. Right?
Or just pushing a guy, like shove, real simple thing. I go in a straight line and then you go straight away from me because I put my 400-pound guy at full tilt right into you. Like,
well, and I get that they've moved
sense.
a lot of those abilities into like the fighter kit, where like you get a bit more mobility and like fight at the same time as you're kind of going up the levels. And I understand that that's like the niche protection that you're getting out of the fighter class now, as opposed to like having all of the abilities and the taunts and stuff that you had in 4th edition. But it feels like a bit of an overcorrection. Right, like
I was gonna say, like, it doesn't make sense to me that my fighter knows how to run forward and push you, but my paladin, who was just a fighter with Jesus, doesn't.
Yeah, and you would figure that Jesus would teach him how to do that. Like,
Jesus loves pushing people.
Did that whole thing in the temple that one time.
He threw a whole flock of pigs off of a cliff. Like, you think that guy doesn't shove people?
I don't remember that story, but
I'm way oversimplifying it. Okay.
All right.
Quick tangent.
Okay, quick sermon.
Cast a legion of demons out of a man into a herd of pigs who then ran themselves off of a cliff. But I wanted to make a funny joke about Jesus throwing pigs off cliffs. So
why is this not a role-playing game in its own right? We need to have like a classic Middle East campaign setting.
I feel like people are very reluctant to say that you get to play as Jesus in your role-playing campaign.
No, he's an NPC. We all know it.
Anyways,
so
speaking of cool shit in combat.
Cool shit in combat, yeah. Like,
it's we've identified what makes combat boring. The play flow can be very linear and structured. It can take a long time because you're just whittling away at a pool of health points until one of you falls over. But what can we do as DMs to make combat more interesting?
All right, so
as well as faster.
The first thing that always comes to mind for me when it comes to that is the setting, right? Like, and utilizing your setting in interesting ways, because like you can have a big open field where you're fighting, and yeah, that has like some tactical opportunities and that you're able to move around freely and stuff, but like unless there's something going on in that field that is more interesting than just some people wailing on each other, it's going to be incredibly boring. And one of the things that I did in one of my recent encounters is I did have a big empty field that my players were fighting in, but the opponents that they were fighting were actually utilizing that terrain, right? So they were small dogs close to the ground, and that meant that if you were more than 5 feet away from them, they were hiding in the grass. They were effectively invisible.
Right. You can have what you might in your head think of as just a big flat plane, but remember to change your scale and look at things from a different perspective. What does a big field actually consist of?
Well, and
very, very rarely in nature do you find an absolutely planed out, completely level surface. So
well, and even when you do, there's like stuff that has figured out how to use that to its advantage. Right?
Sure.
There is never going to be a setting that is actually 100% boring if you actually put some thought into it. But there are also a bunch of settings that just like lend themselves to fight, right? Like, one of my absolute favorites is a restaurant kitchen.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Like, if you end up in a fight in a restaurant kitchen, you have small constrained spaces. You have a whole bunch of different implements and tools around you. You've got improvised weapons hanging around all over the place. You've got fire. You've got water. You've got like hazards of all kinds. Plus, there's usually going to be some extra people, and it turns into a very interesting fight location because of those complicating factors.
Right.
And
I think people just need to start thinking more cinematically. Like, if this was a movie set or scene, what would my heroes and anti-heroes and antagonists be doing, right?
Right. Yeah, just put Jackie Chan in a kitchen and see what happens. Yeah. Right? Like, it's going to turn into a really interesting and entertaining fight because of all of the cool stuff that's around him.
Definitely.
And like, D&D has so many like cool and weird places that you can have a fight. Right? Like,
right.
If you want to like fight on an airship where if somebody shoves you off, you are going to fall 300 feet. Like, that's a very different combat than fighting in like a 30 by 30 stone room, right?
I was going to say the example that comes to mind is I remember years ago following a guy who's tweeting some of the highlights of his campaign that he was running, but this is a guy who put in a good amount of work ahead of time, but he designed essentially a large battle mat scene for one of the climax, at least the penultimate sort of fights in his campaign, where he had put the sort of grid map that you would use normally onto a series of spheres that were just sort of floating in the air around each other, and they all had their own gravity. So the players had to learn how to interact with the environment at the same time as trying to interact with their opponents, and those opponents understood the environment. So the players actually had to spend a bit of time observing their opponents and figuring out what they knew that the players didn't, about how to safely move from orb to orb, and then start thinking about how they could incorporate the physics of those orbs into their attacks to boost them up.
Was that Penny Arcade? I think I remember seeing that.
Yeah, that was Mike Krahulik's campaign.
Yeah. No, that was very cool. Especially considering that was his first campaign. Like, goddamn.
Yeah, such a brilliant, interesting twist on something that I hadn't seen before. But getting back to the idea that setting matters. It's going to take a bit more work. You can get a lot of the way with an erasable battle mat and good descriptions, but just consider getting those extra tools out to really engage the players. At the very least, being able to think in that way and describe it and run it, even if you don't have the necessarily like the physical components to match, but thinking in that way, and then you can make these things happen on a flat plane at your table. You just have to do a little bit of work mentally. But
I'm sure you remember
massively gets rewarded.
I'm sure you remember there was like a fight that we did where like all of the player characters were rappelling down a cliff.
Yes,
and we had a bunch of bad guys show up that were also rappelling down a cliff. And so we just inverted the dimension that the battle mat was on. Right.
Exactly.
One side of the battle mat was up, one side was down. If you wanted to go up, you had to make an athletics check. If you wanted to go down, it was real easy.
It turns out falling is super easy.
Yeah, super, super easy to fall. Getting back up from fall, not so easy. But yeah, and it turned into like a really interesting combat, not just because of the cliff, but because of all of the stuff that came with it. You had like people doing big jumps and leaps around each other. You had people attacking other people's like guy lines and their supports and stuff, right? And so it turned into a much more interesting combat just because of where we were fighting, and like the mechanics that we had to come up with for that.
Yeah, you had to start thinking about, yes, I could swing my axe at this guy, but what if I just swing my axe at the rope above the guy? Is that going to be just as effective? And making that sidestep in your logical processing. I wanted to say, just kind of get out of this is going to be something that sort of reoccurs in the podcast, but I understand that a lot of this stuff takes a lot of prep and a lot of work. Suck it up. Like we're talking about. We're talking about bringing your game and your experience and your player's experience to the next level. So yeah, it's gonna take investment, but investment is rewarded. So when I'm talking about like, he put a shitload of time in painting spheres that he then mounted to a mat, or we had to sit there and rethink how you would do a vertical fight on the side of a mountain, or it's going to take work. It's going to take prep work. But I think the return is absolutely worth it. For the amount of time, for the amount of headspace that Mike's setting has taken up for me years down the road, and I wasn't even playing in it. Like that really is inspiring to me. And again, we're talking about a fight that we played together 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And we still talk about like the cool things that happen in that campaign. We're talking about making lifelong memories and lifelong impact on people. So if it sounds difficult, then I don't know, find a different hobby, because like we're
well, and a little bit just like rise to the challenge, right? Because like
and frankly go ahead.
You see a lot of like the like pro D&D stuff that's happening on like streaming services and stuff, and like all of that stuff looks really cool, but you have to remember there's an entire team behind them. Right, like they just put out a documentary about the guy who does like the art direction for Dimension 20.
Yeah, I still haven't watched that, but I very much want to.
But like the guy's a genius, right? Like the stuff that he's able to put together for their games, where you've just got like a battle mat that is the inside of a bear. Like
and I understand it's not fair to compare yourself necessarily to a guy who's paid to work 40 hours a week on coming up with stuff like this, but he also has to do it on a very short time frame. You have more time to put these things together. If you take a whole month to work on something for your one big Saturday, like that seems like a worthwhile investment for a Saturday you will literally never forget.
And you don't need to sculpt a bear. Like that's the other thing, right? Like you can get away with like a good illustration on a battle map. But mentally,
mentally you can sculpt a bear, and mentally you can come up with a bear that opens up to reveal the insides that your players are running around in. Yeah. We are not going to be a podcast for the first time DM. That's been done to death. We're saying we're going to show you options, and hopefully you come with us to the next level of campaign.
Yeah, for sure.
But getting back to combat, so we've talked about setting and the importance of making the environment a lot more interesting, making the it's one thing to describe a cool place that looks cool visually, but making that environment interactable is just as important. We're talking about traps that activate during a fight. We're talking about hazards that are going off in the middle of a fight. Surprise your characters. They shouldn't have they shouldn't always have perfect information when they go into a fight. Something new should show up, whether it's, the easiest thing is to add new combatants, but instead of a combatant, add a pit, add, fire, spikes, acid, whatever. Make the whole thing something that adds new elements. Not every round, but enough to keep it fresh.
You can provide your players with some additional information that makes the combat more interesting and enticing, just because it has puzzle elements, right? You can build a puzzle directly into your combat encounter, so that your players have to make the choice between do we do the thing that is tactically correct in this situation to try and take out an enemy who is opposing us, or do we focus our attention on this puzzle, the thing that is the goal of whatever this combat encounter is, right?
Yeah, I understand there's 3 goblins in front of us, but Jeff, could you please turn off that fire trap that is cooking our cleric?
Even if just we've got 2 different groups of people that are trying to solve this puzzle door, right? And they are also trying to stab each other. So who is going to figure out the puzzle door first, and then what do you do once it's open, right? These are ways that you can diversify the challenge in a way that doesn't necessarily ratchet up the difficulty of the encounter, but does provide more complexity to the encounter, and also provides a bit more depth and interest in that encounter. And I think that's really, really important. I know that creating a puzzle or a challenge in the middle of a fight is sometimes a pain in the butt, but which one is going to be cooler? You're fighting in a 30 by 30 room, or you're fighting in a 30 by 30 room that is slowly filling with lava, right? One of those is going to be an interesting encounter, and the other one is not.
Well, and if you need inspiration, I mean, going back to this, there are a lot of pre-gen things that were made for specifically 4th edition, dealing with trap encounters. That they didn't call them combats; they were encounters, because it was handled with the same mechanisms of initiative and stuff like that. But you weren't necessarily fighting a person. You could be fighting a room or a thing that has some sort of unique interaction going on with it. Cool. So you've got and you've got time pressures, and like you said, if the room's filling with lava or what have you, you've got a finite amount of time to figure out a solution, or just keep at it. So yeah, I think setting, thinking about things in a blended way, and don't just think of a combat every time as I have to fight. Think of combat as, I prefer to think of it as a physical challenge, as opposed to the mental challenges of the out of combat stuff, the role, the in-town role playing, all that kind of stuff. That's your mental challenge, that's your puzzles, but then you have another puzzle that you solve with your fists.
Another point that I kind of wanted to cover, which is, Josh, why do we fight?
It's a great question. It's frankly, it's a, in some of these violence dynamics courses that I've been part of or observed, one of the first things you talk about is, why are we in a physical altercation, or physical, I don't want to say contest, but why has our disagreement come to a physical end when words have failed? So why do I have to? Why I wasn't able to talk my way past this guard? Now I have to fight him, I guess.
Right, and then maybe it's just me and the fact that I'm an old man who's lost every fight he's been in, but that entire idea seems so alien to me. It suggests a failure of imagination on my part, right? If I haven't found another way to get to what I'm doing, and fighting is the only way, then I feel like I may have screwed up somewhere. And that's just speaking in real life, right? Obviously, an adventurer is a different kind of thing.
Well, speaking as an old man who hasn't lost every fight he's been in, given what's happened in my professional life, sometimes a physical solution is the only sort of negotiation that you're allowed to have with people, depending on their mental state or intoxication levels.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the physical side of things is just problem solving and getting to my desired end state. I wasn't able to get there with my words. Perhaps I can get there with my body. Or this, I think the same goes for the person on the other side of the fist. I don't know. Whatever. Anyways, he obviously wasn't able to communicate his desires, or maybe just the fact of the matter is what he wanted is not possible, and he's not able to comprehend that, but now he's going to try using his physicality to get to that solution. Right. Now, that being said, we need to talk about, again, I like reframing it from combat to a physical challenge, really. Because at the end of the day, not every one of these fights needs to be or has to be an absolute life or death situation.
No, it really shouldn't be. I feel
No.
in most cases. Like, the vast majority of the time, if you have not been able to get past a guard and suddenly you pull a gun, that guard and you are going to have very different reactions to that. And most of the time, if it's just like some Joe Schmo doing a job, he doesn't want to fight you to the death.
No, it's just a job. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you think about like town guardsmen and militias and stuff like that, especially in this setting, half these guys are just conscripts. They're just like, hey, guess what? It's your turn to be the guard this month, right? Do you think he's going to die for something he absolutely doesn't believe in? It's just the thing he has to do to make sure that he is allowed to stay in the village? No, not a chance. And this is something that I've been revisiting with my combats with flora and fauna. Animals don't fight every fight to the death. There's a lot of reasons that animals fight that have nothing to do with wanting to kill the thing that they're fighting. They fight.
Well, they certainly don't want to die like that.
No. They fight for dominance. They fight for, social standing. They fight for sex. They fight for food. They fight out of fear. They fight to protect. Not every combat that you're getting into with a wolf means that the wolf is going to sit there and the whole pack is going to fight you to the death. They're absolutely not.
Well, they're certainly not going to fight you to their deaths, right? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
If they figure that you're going to be easy prey, and I mean, like, shout out to wolves. They are not the horrifying predators that everybody makes them out to be. They are all good boys, and they shouldn't hurt wolves.
Don't get me wrong. They are good, efficient predators, but they're not bloodthirsty monsters.
No. But like,
Dyer has really given wolves a bad rap, I think.
Yeah, for sure. But like, a pack of wolves, if they see you as easy prey, they are going to fight to take you down as much as they feel they can get away with. Right. And as soon as it appears that you are going to put up more of a fight than they're willing to invest, they will peace out and find a different meal, unless they're starving. Right. And
and that's every predator. Predators will only expend as much energy as they think they can get back from eating the thing that they're trying to kill. If you put up a strong enough fight immediately, they're gone. They're like, nope, not worth it. I'll go wait, and I'll wait to find something sick and weak and isolated, right?
But I think that like the core of that, like the core of that whole thing is just like the stakes, right? And that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the why do we fight, right? Like the reason that you have entered into this altercation is very rarely going to be just because somebody was in your way, right? Like, figuring out why your players are so invested in whatever it is that they're doing that they're going to turn to violence for it, and finding out why the NPCs are so invested in what they're doing that they're going to turn to violence for it, is a very easy way to add depth to a combat encounter.
Right. Now, that being said, obviously sometimes there are things that are just in your way, but you can still use that opportunity to think about why they're in the way, if that makes sense. I mean, if we're trying to chase our big bad end guy and he just needs to make an escape, hop on a stagecoach, and get out of there, and he's left some goons behind to slow you down, they're going to try and slow you down, but they're not in the mood to just murder everybody. They understand all we have to do is make sure the boss gets away, and then make sure they don't die, and job done, right?
Yeah. I feel like there's a tendency towards a lack of self-preservation in combat encounters in D&D, and like that is something that I have been taking a lot more seriously in my combat encounters for a couple of reasons. Right, and the first is just because I feel like it adds like depth and flavor to the game when you have like deeper motivations for a combat than like just the baseline, it progresses the plot, we needed a fight here, whatever. And the second is because it creates recurring antagonists, right? Like people who are able to come back, people who have run away, people who gave themselves up at the end of a fight and you brought them to like the constabulary and they spent their night in the stocks and now they're back, right? You now have like familiar faces of people.
And think about, your antagonist as over the course of a whole season. I mean, yeah, you've done one little dungeon delve or whatever. You maybe ran this thing for a couple of months, but how much more tension and excitement is it going to be if this is the guy who every 3 months you think you've got him and it's like, next time, Gadget, and he's gone, right?
Yeah, he shows up with your hand tied to a necklace around his neck playing your guitar.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, beating that guy after a year or even 2 years is going to be so cathartic for those people who've, had him slip through their grasp so many times. I mean, that's the thing about most major villains in recurring series. It's you always almost have them, and you're within a hair of total victory, and then some plot armor saves him and he runs away. But
I mean, you can't do that for every big bad, obviously. Like
no.
Need the win occasionally.
But you have varying levels of big bad. Maybe there's the guy that you punch his lights out because he's just a street level gang leader, and the guy above him, maybe you get him after a couple months, but the guy above him, maybe he takes a year to get to. Things like that, escalating tensions and escalating I can't think of words.
That's real unfortunate for a podcast, Josh.
Yeah, it's a detriment. But just the stakes continuing to build just reemphasizes the fact that those fights matter, but those fights also aren't like absolute answers to the question of how do we deal with this guy.
There was a great like self-published like one-page RPG thing that I read once that I really liked, and it was a My Little Pony Friendship is Magic role-playing game.
Ew.
And one of the things that I really appreciated about it was that like there were fight mechanics in that game, but fighting was often an answer and never the right one.
Right.
Right, and I thought that was a really cool dynamic to bring up, because like occasionally your characters do get into like a physical altercation, but it's never actually going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes in D&D it actually solves the problem, but like in certain settings and with certain like plots and narratives that you're building, it may not always be the answer, and it may be seldom the answer to get into a physical altercation.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point too, is like just your fights need to fit into your story. Right?
Yeah.
Like you can't just have your fight for the sake of having a fight. I kind of like to think of like fights in a role-playing game the same way that I do like songs in a musical.
Okay, yeah.
Right, where like when you're in a musical, you go about your normal business, you're doing normal business things until something happens that is like so important and like carries so much emotional weight that the only answer is to sing and dance about it.
Yeah.
Right. That's what fights in D&D are for me, where you're going about your normal business, you're doing normal business things until the emotional weight of whatever is happening is so high that you have to fight about it.
Yeah.
Right, like it's reached that point where suddenly you're like coming to blows over a thing. And like obviously sometimes you just got like a villain who's doing villain things and like somebody needs to go and take care of him. But like the narrative push, right, getting that story going and making sure that like your fights are either helping you get closer to your goal, whatever that goal is, or if you lose that fight, it sets you back. Right now, you've got added complications in your game, right? Like, that is such an important piece of the combat puzzle that is often left aside because you just need to have like 3 fights in a session.
Yeah.
Right? So like trying to find those like narrative hooks, the reasons that those fights are happening, both for the characters and to push forward that narrative, I think is a really, really important piece of that puzzle.
For sure. Well, we've talked about fights from the outside, but let's talk about fights from the inside. So like you said, things about what is happening during the fight that's narratively compelling or progressing your story, narratively interesting. Maybe a fight is where you introduce your big plot twist,
Oh, absolutely.
Where
100%.
your masked bandit finally reveals himself or whatever, right?
Yeah. The big betrayal scene where like you're fighting next to like the DM's insert character, and suddenly he turns around and stabs you in the back and goes, "Ha-ha, it was me the whole time."
Yeah. As BS as that is, but that's exactly exactly the place to do that, right? And the reason I call it BS is because I know that sting and it feels bad. Like, but that's what makes it so effective and so interesting to do. It's like, oh God, I thought this person was my friend, Well,
and that's such a weird trope to play with too, is like the DM's self-insert character, because like I hate them and never use them.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like if I am going to use one, I have to have a good reason for it, and it's probably going to be like a very narratively important thing that needs to happen. And having that happen in the middle of a fight, not even necessarily like a betrayal, but like having the cavalry show up.
Yeah.
Right? Like those fights that seem absolutely unwinnable.
Right. And then Gandalf appears over the horizon and you're like, oh, thank Christ.
God. Did we talk about my TPK in our last session? I don't remember.
I'm not sure if we did, but we can definitely go over it again.
Okay. So I actually had a situation where the cavalry was going to show up, and like I had already foreshadowed this a few times, right? Like I had like tracks that were leading off of the main character group's tracks. I had like little bits of evidence of like some skirmishes that had happened, or like somebody showing up and cleaning things up after the fact, and so I had dropped these hints with the full understanding that if my player characters ended up getting into some shit that they couldn't handle, they had a guy who had been following them the whole time who was going to step in and handle it. And then one of my players mentioned at the table that it would be ridiculous if some Deus Ex Machina shit happened in the middle of a fight, and I just like saved their bacon out of nowhere, and I was like, well shit, now I can't use that.
Oh, that is so frustrating to me, because one, as a DM, it sort of robs you of your narrative agency. Like, is it Deus Ex Machina? Not really, kind of, no. Maybe, but
I said it. There were hints. There was foreshadowing.
Sure, it didn't fall out of the sky unbidden, but this problem is like now you've got these characters metagaming narrative tropes where it's like, yeah, I know it's happened before, and I know I'm going to do it, but it's also kind of necessary, you crew of useless idiots. Like, I need to have that airbag that I can deploy when you're about to crash and burn your entire party, which turns out when you don't deploy it, the whole party gets crashed and burnt.
Yep. Yeah, so I just killed them in response.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you don't want me to save you? Fine. You're not getting saved. Now you don't get to play that character anymore. Are you having fun yet?
Actually, they are. They expressed that the lethality of the games was a feature, not a bug.
Okay, great. So. Well, I think my point still stands, though. Like,
yeah,
if you're gonna run your mouth about me using standard tropes because like I want to try to continue an engaging story for everyone, then don't be surprised if pulling all of those safety mechanisms out means that you don't have as much fun.
Yeah. And I mean, like, sometimes you just gotta lean on tropes.
Yeah, and you know what? That's fine. They're tropes. Listen, tropes exist for a good reason. You know, saying that it's been done before doesn't mean it's bad. Like, it's been done before many times because it has a purpose and it has a meaning to the story or a use within your overall, you know, objective as a DM.
I mean, George Pulte said that there are only 36 things that can happen in a plot, and Joseph Campbell broke down like every major hero plot forever. So like, yeah, it's all been done.
Yeah, it's fine. Look, you are not the creative writer that you think you are, Mr. I play Dungeons and Dragons every 2 weeks. Like, listen, we're going to go back to some wells every once in a while because they're good wells. They're deep wells. They've been sustaining life for generations.
Man,
like,
I actually really liked that character too. Like,
you know, you're on a hero's journey
in
in a game about heroes. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah. If you don't want to do that, don't play role-playing games.
I mean, it's more of a hero's journey in a game about a pack of D-bags. But...
Okay. I'm just saying, in a game about heroes, don't be surprised when tropes about heroes get used from a narrative perspective. I mean, sorry, like, every story is a retelling of a previous story. You're not original. So don't try. Just have fun.
Yeah.
And don't call me out on my BS because I will kill your entire party.
Well, and like that fight had narrative integration. Like the entire point of that fight was to like establish some stakes and to like set up this character who was going to guide them to the next thing that they were going to do, and then they just fucking died.
Well, and like he doesn't know that, or whoever it was, your player doesn't know that you weren't intentionally using that whole trope as just a way to make an introduction to an important character to the story.
Yeah.
Right? And it's yes, that's been used as a narrative thing for generations. That's fine. That's totally fine.
I still could have done it. Like,
sure, but I don't want to because you're mad at them.
It wasn't even that I was mad at them. It was just like, now that's the thing that is 100% expected.
Yeah,
right? And like, I don't want to do the thing that is 100% expected.
You're just a contrarian.
So what I was going to do instead was like at the end of that combat, I would introduce that character and like he would help them with healing up.
Yeah. Like,
and
he
then
just almost didn't get there in time.
Yeah, and then he never got a chance.
I mean, and hey, you could like you could have chosen to do some DMBS where the whole party collapses and then one person flutters awake because he's done CPR on them and then gets like whatever, right?
Yeah,
I'm just saying you didn't want to. That's fine.
Nope.
That's fine. But for them to be like, you know, I've had plenty of fully lethal combats that end in a fade to black and you wake up in a jail because they dragged your unconscious ass over to it, right?
the cart creaks and
slowly
come to consciousness.
Yeah,
you're finally awake.
Exactly. Because maybe I like your character more than you do, and I think they have more potential. I want to see you explore it. But if you just sit there and be like, you're going to Skyrim start me, aren't you? And I'm like, well, now I'm not, so I guess we both lose on this cool character you made. But also, so just going back to, the reason, stuff in fights and integration into fights, but,
yeah.
Obviously we plan our stuff, but the characters don't plan their stuff. So how do we encourage them to do unplanned things that don't fit into that same cycle that we've talked about before, where the fight goes through these natural phases?
You reward cool shit.
Yeah, basically.
You reward cool shit. Like you have to be in a place where like players are able to try stuff that is crazy and out of the rules and completely out of pocket and fucking weird, and when it goes off, it has to matter, right? Like, I know that you were not a big fan of the like wrestler monk, but it was weird and it was cool. Yeah. And it was different from anything that anybody else was doing, and that player was legitimately trying to do cool shit, and he got rewarded for it, for the most part.
I understand it. As much as it annoys me, I understand the motivation behind it. And frankly, tying into that, you need to model cool shit. I mean, going back to the talk about setting in a kitchen, if you want people to think, part of this is rooting them mentally in the game and the setting and thinking about their characters as real characters, the places that they're in as real places. So if you want them to think that they're really in a kitchen and there's all these options for weird stuff around them, then the first thing that one of your bad boys should do is to grab a pan off the stove and throw it at the nearest guy.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
right?
or
Like you need to be the change you want to see in your fantasy world.
push a guy onto the stove, grab a knife from the knife rack, right? Like all of the things that you've got going around.
Oh, he grabs a guy and presses his face against the plancha. Like, oh.
Yeah, perfect. Like it again establishes the stakes, it establishes the setting, and you get the idea from those like strange maneuvers that that's the sort of thing that we're expecting in this combat.
Yes,
right?
and then you can do something too to lock that in by like, oh, by the way, you now have a horrific burn on your face that's going to be there forever because you got your face pressed into a grill.
Yeah,
you know,
and like you can't expect your players to pull out some Jackie Chan shit if the action that you're dealing with is like some 7th grade play nonsense, right? Like you need to bring the action as much as your players do.
Well, and you know, in a similar vein, I was going to say you can't expect them to do Jackie Chan shit and have the bad guys all do John Wick, right? Like, don't get me wrong, I love those movies, and the way that he fights and is efficient is really cool and interesting, but if we're talking about just making cool, memorable stuff, what do I remember more for unique things that happened? Do I remember Super Cop or John Wick?
Right.
You know,
like,
so
all of the best fight scenes kind of have a few things in common for me, right? Like the utilizing the stuff that's around you is a big deal, right? Like Jackie Chan's use of improvised weapons, Jet Li's environmental fighting. But then usually there's also like dialogue. There's talking.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think my favorite fight scene in any movie of all time is Inigo Montoya versus the Man in Black in The Princess Bride.
Absolutely. Great scene.
It is pretty okay fencing, right? Like it is technically proficient fencing and like interesting to watch, which I think is something that a lot of people kind of disconnect from. Like I've had some conversations with people where it's just like, yeah, the fighting isn't very fast or whatever, and it's like, yeah, but it doesn't have to be.
No.
The characters are fighting on multiple levels. There's like a lot of interesting environmental stuff that's going on with it. Even the like absolutely ridiculous like triple flip off of the like bar that shouldn't hold his weight.
Sure.
But like the thing that really brings that fight out is the dialogue. The way that they're talking as they're fighting. There's banter.
Character development in the scene.
And
swords are flashing, but you learn things. You learn about the Spaniards, research and study, and you learn you not only just from like him explicitly stating it, but when he starts comparing like, oh, you're using this offense, well, I'm going to use this defense, and blah blah blah. Like you learn from him. Oh, like obviously this guy has studied fencing in a way that your random brute hasn't, and then you get plot twists. I mean, we knew that Inigo wasn't left-handed. We didn't know that the Man in Black wasn't left-handed, right?
And I wonder, like, for myself, I didn't even notice that he was fighting left-handed to begin with.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so, like, the first time that I saw that and he switched hands, I was like, oh shit, it's on. Right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
And that's such a beautiful moment. And like they're talking about their fight as if it's chess.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, you can tell that they're like thinking about the fight at the same time that they're fighting, and the fact that they are both displaying who their characters are by having like this amicable discussion in the middle of trying to hurt each other.
Well, and even the lead up to the fight, like Inigo is telling you why he fights and what he's fighting for, and you start to root for him because you're like, actually, I can sympathize with losing my father and wanting to avenge his death, and you have he's holding back, and you're like, okay, great. My hero isn't doing awesome, but he's got this this secret weapon that he's going to pull out when he reveals that he's not left-handed, and then that betrayal of like, oh my god, he can't beat this guy. Am I going to lose this character that within 5 minutes I've grown to care about, from a random thug kidnapping a girl to, oh, he's actually a lot more complex than I realized, because he's only doing this out of a tangential motivation. Like, doing that kind of stuff, again, coming back to, you're going to have to put some friggin' work into your campaign, but those kind of narrative elements, those plot points, take a little bit more writing work that goes beyond just, I'm just going to draw out a dungeon for these guys to stumble through and find kobolds,
Well, and a bit more improv too, right? Because I don't know if everybody knows it, but shit talking is a free action, right?
Yes, absolutely.
You do not have to spend any actions to talk shit to your opponent. You don't need to take any actions to have a conversation. You have 6 seconds while you're fighting. You can be talking that entire time, right? And you can be exposing your character. You can be expositing like what's going on in like the room. You can be providing information to the players.
It doesn't burn your reaction. So when other people are fighting him and fail, taunt the failure.
It's
put your thumb in the wound. Yeah.
Right?
This is probably the best chance that you have, as one of the best chances you have as a DM, to introduce your role playing to the game more. I mean, it's one thing to be playing these NPCs with very, canned responses, and here's the tavern wench with her 6 lines of dialogue telling you to go search the fields for the dingoes or whatever. But being able to embody the villains and make that whole setting come to life more, because it's not just the MacGuffin that they're chasing down the field that occasionally throws a rock at them. Now it's Fezzik, and Fezzik has motivations and talks you through why he's having a hard time fighting you.
And like, not even just telling you why he's having a hard time fighting you, like also just like giving you more information about the situation as it's occurring, right? Like telling you what's going on with this Vicini guy, and the fact that like him and Inigo are not necessarily like super on board with whatever he's doing, right? Like those expository moments don't always have to happen outside of combat, where it's just like
right.
You come across a merchant and the merchant's just like, times are tough, right? You have an opportunity during combat to tell your players who these characters are, right?
Well,
and
if we're getting back to the idea of just blending things together to kind of create more forward momentum, I mean, it doesn't have to be, we beat up the guy, we knock him out, now we tie him to the chair and interrogate him. You can interrogate him during the fight. He's going to give things up as he's fighting. And
he's distracted.
Like
he doesn't know what he's saying necessarily. He's still trying. He's pretty convinced that he's going to stab you in your guts places.
Don't worry, I'm going to stop you from running after my boss so that he can escape to Castle Blackthorn. And you're like, oh, his hideout's at Castle Blackthorn? Fuck. Shit. No. Oh, god damn it. Like,
cool. Swords are down and we're running, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, no, I think that, like, the role-playing option, and again, like, it's the modeling, right? Like, you need to model for your players what it is that you're expecting from them by doing it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you are role-playing at the same time that you're fighting, if you are, like, throwing out the shit talk the same time you're fighting, if you are, like, making use of your environment in new and interesting ways, then that's something that you're going to instill in your players.
And don't get me wrong, sometimes doing that stuff will mean that your antagonists behave in suboptimal ways. That's fine. It's so fine if your bad guys do dumb things that get them killed a little bit faster.
They kind of have to sometimes.
You don't have to play perfectly. Again, this isn't a tabletop skirmish strategy game. You are not always trying to defeat your opponent. You are
I am a little bit.
Well, yes. Don't get me wrong. You're still playing hard, and you're playing to give them a engaging, complex scenario that rewards their effort proportionately. And sometimes that means you go for the kill to give them that tension, that fear. But at the end of the day, we are telling a collaborative story that is largely improvised. Less so by you, because you got a lot of homework to do to get there, to get these combats set up to make them more interesting. But at the end of the day, if a couple of chumps roll over in a fight, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Speaking of rolling, go ahead.
The last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about with this is that system matters, right? Like the game system that you're playing in is going to be encouraging certain types of behavior.
Yeah.
Your average game of D&D, like Dungeons and Dragons, especially 5th edition, is predicated on violence. Like the entire system is built around the idea that you are going to explore an area, you're going to stab whatever is there, and you're going to take its stuff.
Yeah. I was going to say 90% of that player's handbook is how do I fight?
Yeah. How do I enact violence on the world more effectively?
Yeah.
And like there are fun things that you can do with that sometimes, right? Like the mouse guard system. It's really hard to kill people.
Yeah.
Like really, really, really hard to kill people because the narrative weight of a death is considered higher in that game by the system.
Well, and it's just frankly not the objective of that system. You know?
No.
Like the objective of the Dungeons and Dragons is how can we make things kill each other?
Yeah.
You know?
And the thing that I was warning you about earlier with me talking about Dimension 20 again, we've already done it this episode, but like there was a really interesting interview with Abria Iyengar talking about why she chose 5th edition D&D for a game that's about tiny little stoats.
Yeah.
Right? And there are so many systems around, like you've got Mouse Guard, you've got your like there's a Burrows and Warrens or something. There's a few different games that are like built around the idea of being like small adorable creatures.
Of course.
But she specifically wanted to go for a system where all you had was a hammer.
Yeah.
Right? And so the system itself is pushing towards enacting violence, towards enacting like an imperialist ideal upon this game of just, I'm going to go into a place, I'm going to take it over.
Yeah.
Right? And I thought that was really, really interesting. I'm not sure that was like brought out in the gameplay as much as she was hoping, but like thinking about how your system is going to encourage or discourage certain types of actions in combat is also a really important thing. And you can tweak those. Don't be afraid to house rule it. Don't be afraid to like change the way that the combat works in your game or doesn't work in your game to get the results that you're looking for from that narrative.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I think it should go sort of unsaid, but everything that we talk about with these games is just a stepping stone. It's a kickoff point. Mm-hmm. Do whatever you want in your game, but we're trying to inspire your own creativity and your own twists on everything that we do, and just really, my main focus here is hopefully encouraging you to approach these gameplay problems with a different mindset and maybe different ideas than you've been exposed to before. So that hopefully one day something really cool comes out of it. You know, that's if all that happens over the course of this podcast is that one person comes up with a cool thing to happen in their combat that they wouldn't have done before without hearing some sort of inspiration from us, then like that's good enough for me. Our objective is complete.
Yeah, we win.
Yeah,
because it's always a contest, and I always have to win. Hey, thanks for making it all the way through this episode of No Plot Only Lore. If you're looking for more, you can always find us at noplotonlylore.com and on all the very best podcast platforms. If you like what you heard today, please share, rate, and review the show to feed my never-ending need for attention and validation.